Distance by design, interfaces, automation, and the relocation of responsibility. Automation is often described as saving time, reducing errors, and creating consistency. Those are real benefits. But there is a quieter effect that is easier to miss because it does not announce itself. When work is mediated through interfaces, the shape of responsibility changes. Not necessarily because people become worse, but because the system changes what they can see, what they can touch, and what they can plausibly feel accountable for. In many modern environments, action is no longer performed directly on the thing that is affected. Action is performed on a representation, a button, a form, a configuration panel, a template, a queue, a status indicator. Consequence occurs later, elsewhere, and often to someone the actor will never meet. The distance between action and consequence grows, and into that distance enter ambiguity, diffusion of responsibility, and the feeling that outcomes are simply how the world works. The stakes are not melodramatic, they are structural. When distance increases, feedback weakens. When feedback weakens, correction slows. And when correction slows, the system becomes increasingly governed by what is easy to measure, rather than what is worth preserving. The question then is not whether automation is good or bad. The question is what it trains us to notice, what it permits us to ignore, and how the interface itself becomes an ethical and operational boundary. Let us examine the structure. Interfaces in automated systems create distance between action and consequence by translating concrete effects into abstract controls, which relocates responsibility from persons to processes and makes outcomes feel inevitable rather than designed. This sermon will claim that distance is not an accident. It is a predictable product of abstraction layers, incentives, and measurement choices. It will claim that people operating through interfaces are shaped by what the interface reveals and conceals, and that this shaping has consistent failure modes. It will not claim that automation is inherently corrupting, that responsibility can be cleanly assigned to a single party, or that there is a simple remedy. It will also not attempt to replace design questions with moral certainty. The aim is clarity about mechanisms, how an interface compresses a decision, how it edits the story of causality, and how that editing changes behavior over time. To discuss distance between action and consequence, a few terms need stable meanings. First, an interface. In plain language, an interface is the point where a person or one system gives instructions to another system. It can be a screen, a form, a set of commands, a menu of options, or even a policy document that tells staff which code to enter for which category. An interface is not just a window, it is a filter. It decides what actions are possible, what information is salient, and what explanations are available. A well-designed interface can reduce confusion. It can also remove context in the name of speed. Second, abstraction. Abstraction is the practice of hiding details in order to make a system easier to use or reason about. A thermostat is an abstraction. You set a temperature without engaging with valves, fuel supply, or heat transfer. A spreadsheet cell is an abstraction. You write a formula without tracking every electrical state in a processor. In automation, abstraction layers stack. A person might choose an option that triggers a rule, that triggers a workflow, that triggers a queue, that triggers a machine action. Each layer is locally reasonable. Each layer also increases distance. Third, responsibility. Here, responsibility is not a feeling and not a condemnation. It is the practical capacity to understand the likely consequences of an action, to be in a position to influence outcomes, and to be held answerable through some feedback loop. Responsibility requires visibility and agency. If an actor cannot see consequences or cannot modify the pathway, responsibility becomes rhetorical. Fourth, a proxy. A proxy is a substitute measure or representation used when the real thing is difficult to measure or manage directly. A status icon is a proxy for system health. A performance metric is a proxy for value delivered. A category label is a proxy for a complex situation. Proxies are necessary. They are also dangerous when they become the object of optimization. Now, a distinction that will matter throughout: metric versus meaning. A metric is what the system can count: time, throughput, error rate, utilization, compliance rate. Meaning is what the system is for: safety, trust, understanding, dignity, long-term reliability, the ability to recover when something goes wrong. Meaning is real even when it is not quantified. When metrics become the only visible reality in the interface, meaning becomes an invisible externality. We should also name assumptions explicitly. Assumption 1. No actor has total knowledge. In layered systems, each role sees a slice. That is not incompetence, it is a consequence of scale. Assumption 2. Most participants act with mixed motives, some care, some convenience, some habit, some pressure. The system must be robust to ordinary human limits, rather than dependent on exceptional vigilance. Assumption 3. The system shapes attention. What the interface highlights becomes what feels real. What it hides becomes what feels like someone else's problem. With these terms, we can describe the mechanism. When a person acts through an interface, they do not touch the consequence, they touch a representation of a representation. The interface reduces complexity, which is its purpose, but it also reduces causal texture. The action becomes legible and repeatable, and the consequence becomes delayed and distributed. In that gap, responsibility often shifts from being a lived relationship with outcomes to being a compliance relationship with the interface. Consider a simple example. A worker selects from a drop-down menu to classify an item. The menu has 5 categories. The real world has 50 edge cases. The interface makes the classification quick. The automation downstream makes the result immediate. But the interface has also converted a judgment into a selection, and it has converted complexity into a standardized code. If later the consequence is harmful or expensive, the worker can reasonably say, the correct option was not available. The designer can reasonably say, we cannot model every edge case. The manager can reasonably say, the metric requires consistency. Everyone is partly right, and the outcome still exists. Or consider the way automation often separates initiation from execution. One person configures a rule, another person approves it, a system applies it at scale, a third person handles exceptions. No one person experiences the full pathway. Responsibility is not eliminated, it is partitioned. Partitioning can improve safety when it creates checks. It can also dissolve accountability when it creates plausible deniability. The conceptual claim is straightforward. Abstraction layers move knowledge and agency away from the point of action. As they do, the interface becomes the dominant source of truth for the operator, and the operator's sense of consequence becomes dependent on what the interface decides to reveal. This is not a condemnation of abstraction. Abstraction is how complex work becomes possible. The constraint is that abstraction also edits causality. The edited causal story is what people will optimize against, especially under time pressure. That leads into the central paradox. The systems we build to make action easier also make consequence easier to ignore. Automation is usually justified as a path to efficiency, reliability, and scale. Those are legitimate aims. The tension arises when optimization of those aims is mediated through proxies that detach actors from effects. Speed competes with safety, not because anyone prefers harm, but because speed is measured in the interface and safety is often observed later, outside the interface. Proxy competes with reality, because reality is expensive to model and slow to verify. The paradox can be stated this way: the more a system succeeds at removing friction from action, the more it must work to preserve a sense of consequence. Removing friction is the purpose of the interface. Preserving consequence is the condition for responsibility. Both cannot be maximized simultaneously. Consider the incentives embedded in typical automation. First, the incentive toward throughput. Interfaces are designed to reduce cognitive load. Fewer steps, fewer confirmations, fewer explanations. That is a reasonable local optimization. The failure mode emerges when reduced cognitive load becomes reduced moral and operational load. If an action requires only a quick confirmation, it invites a mindset of low stakes, even when stakes are high. The operator learns that the appropriate posture is speed. Second, the incentive towards standardization. Interfaces prefer categories to narratives. Categories are computable. Narratives are not. Standardization can improve fairness and consistency. Yet standardization also creates edge cases where the category is wrong but still mandatory. When the interface forces an imperfect fit, the system teaches operators to treat misfit as normal. Over time, the organization adjusts to the interface rather than the interface adjusting to the world. Third, the incentive toward reversibility as a substitute for care. Many systems advertise, if something goes wrong, you can roll it back. Rollback is valuable, but rollback can become a psychological license to move fast, assuming that failure is cheap. The cost of rollback is rarely fully contained. Downstream effects may already have propagated, trust may be depleted, and attention may be consumed. Reversibility is a technical feature. It is not the same as harmlessness. Now, two failure modes, one primarily individual level and one primarily system level. Individual level failure mode, compliance substitution. The person comes to treat following the interface as equivalent to doing the right thing. This is not stupidity. It is a rational response to constraints. If the organization evaluates performance by adherence to the workflow, then adherence becomes the practical definition of good work. The operator becomes skilled at satisfying the interface, rather than understanding the domain. When something goes wrong, the operator can show they followed the steps. The steps become a shield. The deeper danger of compliance substitution is not only that it excuses harm, it also degrades competence. When judgment is rarely exercised, judgment atrophies. The interface becomes a crutch, and when the interface fails or encounters novelty, the human operator is less prepared to compensate. System-level failure mode, responsibility diffusion by modular design. Automation at scale requires decomposition. Separate teams build separate components, each with its own goals and metrics. Each component is optimized locally. The overall outcome emerges from interactions. When the outcome is harmful, each module can claim it met its requirements. This is often true, but the overall system is still misaligned with meaning. This failure mode persists because modularity is a constraint, not a mistake. Complex systems must be modular to be built and maintained. The trade-off is that modularity distributes causality. Distributed causality makes it difficult to assign ownership of second-order effects. When no one owns the cross-module consequences, those consequences become the default. There is a subtler tension. The interface is frequently designed for the typical case, not the consequential case. This is again rational. The typical case is frequent, and optimizing it yields visible improvements. The consequential case is rare, and its costs are delayed. The interface will therefore often be silent precisely where vigilance is most needed. The system trains attention toward the frequent and away from the critical. Another paradox appears here. Visibility competes with usability. If an interface fully displayed all downstream consequences, it would be unusable. If it displays too little, it becomes a machine for plausible ignorance. Designers, operators, and organizations must choose where to place the boundary of visibility. That boundary is not neutral. It encodes what kinds of consequences are considered relevant. Notice what this means about the phrase natural outcome. When a system is stable, its outputs feel like the landscape, weather not architecture. People stop asking why certain consequences are common. They describe them as what happens. But the commonness of an outcome is often a sign of repeated design choices interacting with incentives. Optimization intensifies this effect. When a metric becomes a target, behavior aligns to the metric, and the metric becomes less informative about meaning. This is not a cynical trick. It is a feedback loop. The interface surfaces the metric because it is measurable and comparable. People learn that the metric is what matters because it is what the system recognizes. Over time, meaning is reorganized around what can be measured. This is the core tension. Automation promises control, but it often produces a kind of managed blindness. The interface gains power while limiting understanding. The operator gains the ability to act at scale while losing the ability to feel the scale. None of this requires malice. It requires only a set of reasonable local optimizations interacting over time. When interfaces create distance between action and consequence, the effects are rarely immediate. They accumulate as second-order patterns, changes in habits, expectations, and institutional memory. One second-order effect is normalization of externalities. When consequences are displaced to another team, another time, or another population of users, they become easy to treat as background noise. The interface shows a success message. The cost is handled elsewhere. The organization begins to budget for the cost as if it were a natural expense, rather than a design choice that could be revisited. A related effect is the transformation of error into bureaucracy. In direct work, an error is a moment of learning. The person sees what broke. In mediated work, an error is often a ticket, a log entry, a form, an escalation path. The learning is delayed and diluted. The system may become excellent at processing errors while becoming poor at preventing them. The interface makes recovery legible. Prevention remains ambiguous. Another effect is moral licensing by division of labor. When tasks are broken into small steps across roles, each person can honestly claim they handled their step correctly. The overall harm then seems to come from nowhere. This is not hypocrisy. It is a structural artifact. The division of labor is valuable, but it can separate care from impact. Distance also changes language. People start describing outcomes in passive voice. It was flagged, it was queued, it was processed, it was denied, it was approved. Passive voice mirrors passive responsibility. When actions are framed as events that occur rather than choices that are made, the possibility of redesign becomes less visible. A further second-order effect is over-reliance on default settings. Interfaces must choose defaults to reduce friction. Defaults are powerful because they are taken without deliberation. In automated systems, defaults become the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance becomes the path of greatest volume. The consequence is that a single design choice can shape a large portion of reality, not through coercion, but through convenience. This leads to a persistent trade-off: stability versus adaptability. Automated interfaces reward stable, standardized flows. Adaptability requires exceptions, overrides, and narrative context, all of which are costly. The system therefore tends to harden. What begins as an expedient rule becomes an institutional fact. The longer a rule operates, the more other processes depend on it, and the higher the cost of changing it. This is a lock-in effect. It is not always visible in the interface because the interface is designed to hide internal dependencies. Another consequence is the erosion of what could be called consequence intuition. In direct physical action, cause and effect are tightly coupled. You lift something heavy and you feel the weight. In mediated action, you click and nothing in your environment changes. The cost exists elsewhere. The operator's body and senses do not register the consequence. Over time, it becomes harder to estimate impact without consulting dashboards or reports. The system replaces intuition with instrumentation. Instrumentation can be an improvement, but it has a failure mode, when the dashboard becomes the reality. If the interface reports that all is well, then all is well, even if unmeasured harm accumulates. This is how metric capture occurs. The system becomes optimized for what it can display. Why do these patterns persist? They persist because they are efficient. Distance reduces conflict at the point of action. It reduces the emotional and cognitive load of making hard trade-offs. It also reduces the need for every operator to understand the full domain. Organizations prefer systems that are trainable, auditable, and scalable. Interfaces deliver those properties. They persist because feedback is slow. If consequences arrive weeks later, through aggregated reports, it is difficult to connect them to specific design choices or specific operator behaviors. Without tight feedback loops, learning becomes speculative. Speculation competes poorly with visible metrics. To hold responsibility at the point of action requires time, training, autonomy, and often the permission to slow down. Many systems are built under constraints that reward speed and predictability. Responsibility in the richer sense competes with throughput, and they persist because the system often works. Most of the time, automated interfaces produce acceptable outcomes. That success is real, but success can conceal the cost paid at the margins, in edge cases, in long-term brittleness, and in the gradual narrowing of what the organization considers thinkable. The point is not to treat automation as a threat. The point is to observe that automation changes the location and texture of responsibility. When we pretend it does not, the second-order effects become the unchosen doctrine of the system. If interfaces can relocate responsibility, what follows is not a single conclusion, but a disciplined stance. First, it is worth noticing that distance is not merely physical or temporal. It is informational and interpretive. The interface does not just separate an operator from the outcome. It supplies a story about what the operator did. That story can be, you executed a task, you complied with a process, you increased throughput, you reduced error. Those stories are not false, but they are partial. Partial stories become dangerous when they are treated as complete. Second, the desire to remove friction should be treated as a design choice with a cost. Friction is often framed as waste. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is the last remaining place where judgment is exercised. In mediated systems, a small pause, a moment of review, a visible downstream dependency can function as a cognitive speed bump. The trade-off is real. Too much friction reduces usability and can create its own errors. Too little friction turns high-impact action into routine gesture. Third, responsibility should be understood as a property of the whole arrangement, not merely of the person at the keyboard. If a person cannot see consequences, cannot influence the pathway, and is rewarded for speed, then exhortations to be careful are structurally thin. Conversely, if a system makes consequences legible and gives operators meaningful control, responsibility becomes practical rather than rhetorical. Fourth, the most persistent harms in automated systems are often not dramatic failures but quiet reallocations. Who bears the cost of exceptions? Who absorbs ambiguity? Who spends time cleaning up what the interface cannot represent? These reallocations are incentives in disguise. They are second-order effects turned into routine, and yet the tension does not resolve cleanly. The world is complex. Interfaces must simplify. Abstraction is necessary. Scale demands automation. The problem is not that we cannot eliminate distance. The problem is that distance, once created, tends to be forgotten. So the reflective question is narrow and ongoing. What does this interface encourage its users to ignore? And what does it encourage them to treat as unquestionable? This is not a call to purity. It is an invitation to observe constraints, incentives, and feedback loops without pretending that any system can carry meaning without loss. A system can be optimized, or it can be interpreted, or it can be questioned. It can do all three, but not all at once and not without cost. The discipline is to keep that cost visible, even when the interface prefers to hide it. Clarity requires restraint.